In 1980, Don Henley said the Eagles would play together again when hell freezes over. 14 years later, it did exactly that. In 2016, after the death of Glenn Frey, Henley said the band was finished. He called it a fitting farewell, and yet the Eagles returned again. Now in 2026, when asked how much longer they'll continue, Henley paused and said, "I think this year will probably be it." He said things like that before, and they always came back. But this time, it feels different. The story of the Eagles was never the story of just one man. But as the sun begins to set on one of the greatest bands in rock history, the decision to turn off the stage lights for the final time may ultimately fall on a single set of shoulders. Over the years, the Eagles would include some of the finest musicians in rock and roll. Guitarist Joe Walsh joined the band in 1975, replacing the multi-talented Bernie Leadon and helping transform the group's sound. His gritty guitar work, alongside fellow guitarist Don Felder, pushed the band beyond its country rock roots and into a harder, more electrified era that produced some of their biggest hits. And then there was bassist and vocalist Timothy B. Schmidt, who stepped into the group during a turbulent moment following the departure of Randy Meisner in 1977. Schmidt's smooth voice and steady presence helped anchor the band through some of its most challenging years, and remarkably, he, along with Walsh, remains on stage with the Eagles to this day. But through every breakup, every reunion, the loss of founding member Glenn Frey, and every reinvention of the band, one figure has remained constant. From the very beginning of the Eagles' story, there has been one man who has been there through every chapter. That man is Don Henley. Henley wasn't just the Eagles' drummer. Over time, he would become the band's voice, its chief songwriter, and ultimately the keeper of its legacy. And to understand why the possible end of the Eagles carries so much weight, you have to go back to where Don Henley's story began. Don didn't start his career out as a singer. He wanted to be a drummer. Donald Hugh Henley was born in 1947 in Gilmer, Texas, and grew up in the small town of Linden. His parents enjoyed music and kept plenty of records on hand. Don said he was brought up on country and western swing, blues, and gospel. His first record he ever bought was of Elvis Presley, but it was watching the Beatles' first TV appearance that lit the fire under him. He started beating out rhythms on his school books with his fingers and pencils, and then one day his mother took him to a music store in Sulphur Springs and bought him his first set of drums, a set of red sparkled Slingerlands, which Don says he still has today. His first band was a three-piece Dixieland jazz group. Nobody sang as they just played instrumentals. His father's dream was for Don to go to college, and he helped Don save up money. And between that and the money Don made on gigs, he paid for himself to go for 3.5 years of college to North Texas State University. Don only took one music course, which he flunked, but he did major in English, which came in very handy when he was to start writing songs. After a lucky break and being friended by Kenny Rogers, the band Don was in at the time, called Felicity, later changed their name to Shiloh, caught a break. Kenny was looking for groups to produce and took the band out to Los Angeles and let them live with him for about 4 months and helped them record an album. But nothing good really happened for Shiloh, except it got Don Henley out to the West Coast, and it was there he would meet Glenn Frey, who was on the same record label as him. They had a few things in common besides music and soon became friends. Hanging around the Troubadour Club was the thing to do at the time for musicians, and Don was no exception. It was in that club that Linda Ronstadt was to hear him play drums and sing. Her and her manager, John Boylan, was putting a backing band together for her. After an audition, Don was hired. And it was during these road trips, backing Linda Ronstadt, where Glenn Frey, who was also hired to play guitar, became very close as they roomed together and started talking about putting a band of their own together. They would end up getting Bernie Leadon and Randy Meisner and forming what was to become the Eagles. To record their first album, they were sent off to London with producer Glenn Johns. The only song recorded over in England that Don sang lead on was Witchy Woman, which he helped write with Bernie Leadon. After returning, the song Nightingale got added to the track list late in the process at the orders of label boss David Geffen, because otherwise Witchy Woman would have been the only song on the album with Don on lead vocals. The second album was Desperado, and it is where things in the band started to change a little. Glenn and Don started writing together. Glenn and Don were involved in writing 8 of the 11 songs on the album. And although they came up with some good songs, the album didn't do all that well. One of the reasons was said to be producer Glenn Johns wanted to produce the album quickly and economically. Each track was therefore limited to 4 or 5 takes, and requests to record more were refused. Don would later say that his greatest regret was that he did not sing as well as he could have on the title track Desperado, and would have liked to redo the song. The third album, On the Border, is where more change came in. Although Glenn Johns would produce a couple of songs, Bill Szymczyk was to take over to try and get the band a more rock and roll feel. Now the ironic thing about all of this is, of the 2 songs that Glenn Johns produced for the album, one was a love song ballad, Best of My Love, which the lead vocals were sung by Don, and it was to go on to become the band's first #1 hit. This is also the album guitarist Don Felder was brought in on to give it a more rock edge. After Felder was hired as a full-time member, the 4th album came out, One of These Nights. The biggest selling single off of it was a slow ballad type, Lion Eyes. Although if you listen to the album, you can hear some of the songs taking on a more rock edge with Felder's guitar work. Don sang lead on the title song, One of These Nights. Don and Glenn did most of the songwriting again, and Bernie Leadon quit the group. Enter Joe Walsh. Now here's where the Eagles, in my opinion, really made the drastic changeover to rock and roll and turned this group and headed it in the right direction to become mega stars. But the question here is, was all of this because of adding Joe? I do agree Joe made a huge difference in the sound, but I think one of the things that is very overlooked is Don Henley. Don always sang a song or 2 on each of the last 4 albums, but that was all about to change. And even though it was probably tough on Glenn Frey, he was the one to say it best. Without Don Henley, we'd just be Love Songs and Harmonies. We'd be Air Supply. This makes a lot of sense in hindsight. Don was to step up on the next album, Hotel California, and sing lead on 5 of the album's songs. Glenn Frey, Randy Meisner, and Joe Walsh had 1 cut each. I really think this was the turning point for Don Henley. I know Joe Walsh had a big part of the Eagles making this turn, but you cannot leave out Don taking on the load as the main vocalist as a big part also. This album made Don Henley more than just a singing drummer in the background. It brought him out front. Don was a good drummer, nothing spectacular, very solid with good meter. He did great work in the studio. While his drumming was steady, it was his voice that just seemed to get better and better. When the Long Run album came out, it was no surprise that Don carried the lead vocals on 5 songs and shared with Glenn Frey on 2 more. After the Eagles' breakup in 1980, Don went on to have a very successful solo career. He launched his solo career in 1982, first appearing as Stevie Nicks' duet partner on the top 10 single Leather and Lace. Then Dirty Laundry, the top 10 hit from his 1982 solo debut, I Can't Stand Still. But 1984's Building the Perfect Beast was a blockbuster, aided by the stylish MTV hit Boys of Summer. 3 other singles were pulled from that album. The top 10, All She Wants to Do Is Dance, followed by the top 40, Not Enough Love in the World, and Sunset Grill, all arriving in 1985. And he then labored on his third record, 1989's The End of the Innocents. Although this didn't have as many top 40 hits, the title track reached 8, followed by The Last Worthless Evening and The Heart of the Matter, both peaking at 21. It was a bigger hit, going platinum 6 times. But after it ran its cycle, Don decided to turn his attention to reuniting with the Eagles in 1994, a project that kept him busy off and on for the next 2 years. His solo album slowed. He released Inside Job in 2000, 11 years after the end of Innocence, and then took 15 years to record Cass County, his return to country rock roots. But he was never out of the spotlight thanks to the ongoing work of the Eagles. Don says he got his famously rough voice from belting out R&B tunes at Texas college gigs in his early bands. The frat boys would always want James Brown, Wilson Pickett, Otis Redding music, which I had to learn, he said. I got hoarse singing that music 4 hours a night, trying to sound raspy until my voice blew out. Years later, that rasp in his tenor voice would define Eagles classics such as Hotel California from 1976 and solo tunes like The Boys of Summer from 1984. He has an amazing voice that is a mystery to us all, says songwriter J.D. Souther, who wrote or co-wrote many of the Eagles' hits. I know we all have our favorite singer from the Eagles, but you can't deny success. Out of 5 number 1 singles that the Eagles produced in their career, Don Henley was the lead vocalist on 3 of those songs. As a solo artist, Don released 5 albums, and they have sold over 10 million units worldwide. He had 8 top 40 singles and won 2 Grammy Awards and 5 MTV Video Music Awards. Even though Don's voice carried the Eagles through the later albums, it was Glenn Frey who was still their leader. Then, in January of 2016, Glenn Frey would pass away at the age of 67. Don Henley expressed profound sorrow, calling Glenn his brother and acknowledging him as the spark plug and the man with the plan who started the Eagles. He ended by saying the band was over. He called it a fitting farewell. But in July of 2017, with the help of Glenn's son Deacon and Vince Gill, Don took the Eagles back out, and again they were a hit. They are now coming up on 9 years together, and in July, Don will turn 79 years old. They announced a long goodbye tour starting in 2023, and here we are in 2026, and no matter how you look at it, Father Time is on their heels. Don said this will probably be it and bring a close to the Eagles. But perhaps the real question now is, are we witnessing the final year of the Eagles? Is this the last year for one of the greatest bands of all time? For myself, I believe this is the last year for the Eagles. If you want to find out how the Eagles founding members got their start, then you'll want to watch this video right here.